There's always been the meme within the tech community around gaming on Linux, how it's never really been as good as it is on Windows for the majority of popular games, especially multiplayer games due to a multitude of factors such as over-reliance on external libraries that only work on the Windows platform, or the inclusion of Linux compatibility killers like anti-cheats with ring zero access to the host system. These have always been just some of the reasons behind factors that turn your everyday gamer away from the consideration of using Linux to game on as a daily driver. On paper, gaming on Linux should give the user a boost in terms of performance because of the lower overhead required to keep the operating system functioning in the background as you play the game. More system resources are free for the OS to dedicate to the task at hand. And for games that have been developed to run natively on Linux, in other words, that is to not utilise any external software such as Wine or Proton that sort of act as a translator for Windows exclusive dependencies, games do often run with greater performance on Linux when compared to Windows on the same hardware, with a few little conditions, but those times when games run better on Windows than on Linux is largely down to issues with compatibility layers or like proprietary NVIDIA drivers, that kind of stuff. But there comes our saviour to the rescue, our knight in shining armour, SteamOS. Those of us who have been around in the Linux space for a while may have just had a sort of Vietnam kind of flashback to a less civilized age over a decade ago, where Steam first did a little dabble within the operating system environment with the release of the OG Steam machine back in 2013 that ran its own operating system known as SteamOS, or as it is now known, SteamOS version 1 and later on version 2. Remember those little Steam machine things? Yeah, they were definitely something. And that dodgy looking controller, which I heard actually wasn't that bad. However, this time around, Steam are doing things a little differently, having already proved the operating system's worth with over a decade more of development time having been put into it, as well as a solid public satisfaction level received with the release of the Steam Deck that ran a hugely improved iteration of SteamOS. Steam now have a much stronger foundation to truly release a possibly very good and overall decent operating system that would be open to users running as their daily driver. Over the better part of the previous decade, Steam's compatibility layer known as Proton has seemingly gone from stride to stride, having enabled previously Windows exclusive video games available through Steam to be able to be played on Linux with minimal drawbacks to the performance. And it's this compatibility layer that is the real driver when it comes to running games on Linux non-natively, and the single biggest selling point to Steam and, by extension, the SteamOS operating system. The Steam Deck was, in more recent times, the first real test dummy when it came to a homemade operating system built around gaming on the Steam platform, and it was, so far, pretty damn successful. The OS worked, games ran well, and whilst I haven't ever used a Steam Deck personally, I've heard they are great little gaming computers when it comes out to playing Skyrim or No Man's Sky at the back of the class, or in the library with some headphones. And that's why it's successful. Gaming on Linux has historically always been a little bit finicky. Getting compatibility layers working, making sure you've got the right version, then finding out you've got an NVIDIA GPU and you just throw it out the window. But the Steam Deck in combination with SteamOS just worked, and it worked really well. And for the amount of money you're paying for one of those, in the form factor that it's in, you're getting a really good bit kit. There has, however, been a thorn in the side of both Valve, the owner of Steam, and Linux users. The godforsaken kernel level anti-cheat. This is a beast that some make the argument of purposefully targeting the Linux platform to ensure that it won't run on them at all, which is understandable from the misguided developer's point of view. If you're wanting to prevent cheating in your game, Rust and Destiny 2 are some good examples of this, then the knee-jerk reaction is to try and actively target those platforms that a disproportionately large amount of cheaters use to play your game, which in this case is Linux. There are things wrong with this idea, of course, like the fact that cheating can still be rampant within these games, even though the anti-cheat targets platforms that the developers see as oases as an oasis for cheaters as they develop better tools within Windows instead. And just going off on one for a little second, installing a video game with an anti-cheat that has kernel level access to your system. I mean, that is just sketchy and a disaster waiting to happen, regardless of the security implications of which kernel level anti-cheats like easy anti-cheat bring up, of which there are plenty to discuss, don't get me wrong. Maybe it's a good thing that the concepts of that level of access for a video game anti-cheat doesn't sit well with the majority of Linux users. I mean, people go over and change to using Linux as their daily driver in order to get away from the dirty clutches of Microsoft Windows or the abusive grasp of Apple. But as long as the game you're wanting to enjoy doesn't use Ring 0 anti-cheat like the aforementioned easy anti-cheat, gaming on SteamOS has actually been proven to perform much better than on Windows with the same hardware. The lower level of overhead when it comes to running Linux is really starting to pay off. This means computers with limited hardware with Windows installed that have traditionally struggled to run games may be given a second life with SteamOS, at least theoretically, only time will tell. Another thing worthy of note is some of the choices made by Valve when developing SteamOS. With the original SteamOS released way back in 2013 on the Steam machines, the OS was based on Debian 8, which gave it a good level of stability, but did not help with the speed of updates. Well, with the newest iteration of SteamOS, version 3, they chose to base it off of Arch Linux, which I guess makes sense because of the rolling release method Arch goes with when it comes to software updates. FYI, Arch Linux is basically cutting edge in terms of updates when compared to Debian or Debian-based distros, just in case you didn't know. And with gaming being the number one thing with SteamOS, the most up-to-date graphics drivers, compatibility layers, etc. is much more important than it is on a system running Debian or Ubuntu. However, even with SteamOS being based on Arch, it is not entirely open source. Of course, being Arch Linux, it comes with the Steam application, which itself is based off of Chromium but is not open source. The same goes for the included proprietary graphics drivers, which they have included to improve gaming performance, as using the open source graphics drivers on something like an Nvidia GPU never seems to get that good of a performance out of it when compared to the proprietary drivers, so it does make sense for Steam to include that when they're distributing SteamOS. So, when will we be able to get our open source hands on SteamOS? Well, unfortunately, not for a little bit just yet. SteamOS is due to come out sometime during 2025, most probably during the first half of the year. I will most definitely be downloading SteamOS and giving it a try in a VM as soon as it comes out, so stay tuned for that. Do you think SteamOS will turn out differently than the previous version from over a decade ago? Make sure to put your thoughts down in the comments. I remember there being quite a bit of conversation around the Steam machine and how lackluster it turned out to be, but I'm really hoping that this time they're going to do it right. And with it being based on Arch Linux and with the decade of improvements to Steam compatibility layers such as Proton and just Linux compatibility with video games in general, I think it's going to be a pretty good solution for the gaming community who want to move over to Linux. Thank you very much for watching. Like the video if you enjoyed it and subscribe to the channel to see more of this stuff. I will see you, hopefully, in my next video.